Captain Sam Schropp retired and moved away to paradise. We have a fair amount to cover today. Welcome back to the show. I was looking actually, I believe you were episode 54, and I'm planning this to be episode 164. So I've been pretty busy since we last spoke, and I know you have too. We'll get into all that. There's a number of topics we've discussed in private, specifically a certain rather heavy topic. I'm not sure if we can cover it today. Um, we'll get into that towards the end of this
Yeah,
conversation, I expect, if we're able. But in the meantime, fill me in, sir. How has life been since we last spoke?
it's been very good. My wife and I sold our ranch in New Mexico. Uh, I have been appointed by the governor of New Mexico to fill out the term of a man who died in office as a county commissioner for Torrance County, New Mexico. That took up a lot of time for a retired guy. And when that term was up in December 31st, we had made arrangements to move to Costa Rica. And got our dog and our cats down here on the 17th of March. And I got here then. I had to go back. The cats got here the 17th. I had to go back and meet the pet shipper for the dog. And I arrived here about the 15th of April. And we've been settling in very well, making a life for ourselves here.
Is that a permanent plan? Well,
Yeah, yep. We are working at this time. Costa Rica is very, very friendly to immigrants. We can live here 180 days at a time on a tourist visa. We are working on a residency visa as retired aficionados, as retirees here, which will qualify us for their single year health care. And
the audio is having some trouble now.
okay,
You're in and out a fair amount. I'm not sure how that internet connection is, but that might be the issue.
how is the audio now? Oh, it says the internet connection is unstable. So we're using a lot of bandwidth.
Yeah, that might be.
So
Uh,
let me get my wife off of her computer. Pause this for just a second.
sure, I'll be here.
Right. So let's try this again. She was using her laptop in there, so we were eating up a lot of bandwidth. So I'm a little surprised at that. Costa Rica is a very progressive country in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways, it's more like the 1970s in the US as far as roads, local schools, local markets, hardware stores. In other ways, fiber optic internet is the norm throughout the country here. They're very progressive in other ways, education, things like that. So kind of getting the best of both worlds here.
We're still having some audio issues, but we'll keep plodding along. You said it's kind of like the 70s. Do you feel more at home? Feel more like childhood? What were you up to in the 70s? Was that the start of your towboating career?
Yeah, yes. So in the 19, I grew up alongside the Mississippi River on a peninsula between the Illinois and Mississippi rivers at mile 227 UMR in Golden Eagle, Illinois. And so the roads, very rural, the roads there were a lane and a half, and basically they were a cold patch laid on top of tar, never really were a road, a cow path that was improved. And so I started working on the Golden Eagle Ferry in 1975 while I was going to the University of Missouri at St. Louis. $2.40 an hour there and 15 credit hours at UMSL cost me about $250 a semester. So I could make enough money, and I had some different work study programs and different things going on that helped out with that. And I wanted to be a phys ed major, high school coach, up alongside the river watching towboats go past. And the third year of college, I decided I really wasn't learning anything I wanted to do. And I went to work for Inland Oil and Transport. Well, first I went to work for Streck Steamers running excursion boats. I had gotten a passenger operator license while I was working on the Golden Eagle Ferry. And after about 3 months working 90 hours a week for 600 a month, I went to work on line haul towboats for Inland Oil and Transport. And so that was really my first time being away from home. Uh, I knew the job, wasn't afraid of hard work. So at that time, uh, for instance, we ran unit tows, but we also ran grain barges during the grain season. So we would get into St. Louis northbound and drop our northbound tow. That involves stripping all of the rigging off by hand, going across the river to our southbound tow, and carrying all the rigging back out. We didn't go coupling to coupling. We faced up and carried every piece of rigging back and forth and then laid the double ups underway. And of course, today, uh, the fallacy of that has been shown that turnaround times are lost time on the boat at $300 an hour, $400 an hour for a modern towboat. So you drop the rigging, you pick the rigging up coupling by coupling, you swap out rigging, we drop rigging, those kind of things. But in those days, the captain would get the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and you could see him up there reading the paper as we were stripping rigging and carrying it back. And then we'd go across and face up, and he'd do the same thing, be reading the paper while we carried all the rigging back out. The other thing
Were
that went on,
were
go ahead.
were radios as dependable back then, or hand signals, flares? What were y'all using
We
way back when?
used hand signals. We did not have handheld radios. So it was all with hand signals, and the majority of the work was done on lines. For instance, if we had drops at I'll say uh, Blytheville or Carruthersville, you would snake barges out of the fleet on a line. If you were there at night, there was no tug service. And so we'd come in, snake a barge out on a swing line, work it around and get it into tow, doing all of it on lines, which is now a lost art. Uh, but there's a good reason for that. Once again, it was faster and it's safer to do it with tugs.
Well, explain that lost art for those today that have never maybe heard of or done any such thing. I've got one too, sir, for today's meeting.
All right,
Yeah,
good deal.
this was our the 10th of 10 new builds we did, uh,
Gotcha.
16s and 2000s and stuff. Anyway,
I think this one was one of my 5 year, maybe a 5 year award was a set of coffee cups or a Christmas award was given.
I'd forgotten you worked for Ingram.
Hmm. I was with Ingram for 15 years,
Okay.
and we can get to that in a little bit, but that is when the paradigm shift started with safety at Ingram, starting in about 1998. Uh, and so we'll get back to that. But in working with lines, in order to pull a barge, let's say you go into a barge or a fleet that is 3 wide and maybe 4 or 5 tiers long, and you need a barge out of the outboard tier. We would go in with the tow and lay alongside, run a line across a single part line to the center cable of the barge we were picking up, and then back up slowly, and that would swing that barge out of the fleet. At that point, you could turn the last of the lines or wires loose and pull it out into the river current, let it fall down in, and work it back into where you wanted it to be. And all of that was done on uh, about a 50 or 75 foot line, a single part line. And so that required a lot of skill in line handling and experience in listening to how the line was working. Uh, they had carbon lights at that time. We weren't using xenon or LED lights. And so the lighting was not all that great. You always had a flashlight that you could shine back towards the pilot house to make sure that the pilot on watch was seeing your hand signals. And the hand signals that are in the deckhands manual are the ones which we used every watch to communicate with the pilot house. So when we caught a swing line, what we call a swing line, would come from the outboard corner of our tow, go to the center cable of the barge to be pulled out, swung out of the fleet, and then you would turn and face the pilot house so the pilot knew which direction you wanted him to work the engines. And if you wanted him to back up, you would face towards the boat and you would move your arms in a circular motion to get him to work astern propulsion.
Now, this was unit tows?
So we did that with unit tows, but at that time we were also picking up grain barges. And so during the harvest season, Inland Oil contracted with SCNO to bring barges from St. Louis to New Orleans and then empties back up and pick up some SCNO empties along the way. So I'd been around fleet operators. I'd spent some time with a really good fleet boat pilot, Richard Garner, who's kind of a legend in the St. Louis Harbor. Uh, he had invited me along when I was working on the passenger boats to see those operations. And so I was familiar with how all of that worked. I'd really never done it hands-on. Uh, the mate on the first inland boat that I rode was a man named Howard Timms, who had, was a licensed mate, had worked for federal barge lines for years and years, had started out in the 1920s as a cabin boy. And so he was old. He was 70 or 72 at the time. We had a large enough crew that old Happy Timms from Metropolis, Illinois, didn't really need to get engaged in the hands-on work. And so I was on watch with him, and he taught me how to do all of this line handling and how to lay rigging on barge line tows.
Tell me more about Richard Garner and his story. You said he's kind of a godfather of the St. Louis Harbor. Of course, Ingram, I think last year now acquired SCF and pretty much owns that St. Louis Harbor now. So I'd love to
Yeah.
know what you found back then and kind of what you know of the last time you stepped off a boat.
So sure, 1975, Eagle Marine, the old Eagle Boat Store that had been a ship chandler steamboat, way old entity in the St. Louis Harbor, Eagle Marine had fleet boats. And so like Federal and Valley Line had fleets of barges in the St. Louis Harbor, but they did not have tugs that serviced their own fleet. So Eagle contracted with Federal to do all of their work. Federal Barge Line truly had watchmen, a guy that had a little doghouse on the spar barge that made sure that everything was pumped out and wasn't breaking loose, and that the lanterns, because they still use kerosene lanterns, that the lanterns on the outboard side of the fleets were still in operation. And so Richard had a very distinctive voice, was from South St. Louis, was an excellent boat handler, knew all of the currents, uh, like the back of his hand. And he had started out as a deckhand. He'd come from Arkansas, had gotten a job, was living in South St. Louis, had gotten a job with Eagle as a deckhand and worked his way up to being a pilot. And I guess he was what they had a true dispatcher in the office who not only had the fleet diagrams, but he also assigned what boats were working there. and Richard would be what you would call the coordinator boat now for that area. So there were fleets at the foot of Gasconade Street, and then down at Chesley Island was also another fleet. Then there were fleets above the Eads and Veterans Bridges as well. And then a number of fleets. Let's see, Valley Line had their fleets right below the Merchants Bridge. I think that was Lesperance Street. And all of those, at that time, all of those fleets and all the landmarks in the St. Louis Harbor were identified by the street names, a lot like the New Orleans Harbor was back in the day. So Richard was very well known, great boat handler. Let me operate the Nancy Allen, which is still around someplace running. And so I got, oh, he'd stand over my shoulder and I got to operate this boat a little bit and kind of learn about putting barges in a fleet and what it took from up there. And so I was very well prepared when I went to work on a line haul towboat.
Well, tell me also, Pappy Timms, you seemed to light up a little bit when you mentioned him. Of course, a professional mate. It started back in the 1920s, you said. Tell me what,
Right.
maybe some stories he shared with you, his story, how he got where he was, and yeah, I like this history lesson so far. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. So, there's been a lot lost in modern day towboating. We don't sit at the table together anymore and as a crew and listen to stories, which is a good way to learn how to do things.
Did you
So
see
how it,
that? Did you see that change drastically in the time of cell phones and distractions and entertainment,
yes.
constant entertainment? Well,
Yep.
about what year roughly did you kind of go, wait a minute, the old ways are gone?
Well, it started uh, in about 2000, but I was the master on the R. Clayton McWhirter at the time. And I told my guys I expected us all to sit and eat together, that we were a crew and we could behave like a crew. Then, as you started losing cooks, reducing crew sizes and losing cooks, it was catch as catch can. So guys are coming into the galley and frying up some chicken tenders and tater tots, and that's a meal. So there's a lot of that bonding and that kind of trust, because the things we were doing with lines, whether it's working into a lock on the upper miss or making pickups on swing lines and lines, required a hell of a lot of trust between the guy working the line and the guy in the pilot house. Because, as you know, it's really easy to break a 2-inch lock line, and when it does, it goes off like a cannon. It'll take your head off. So when someone asks you to go out there and catch a line in the old days at lock 3 or lock 6 or one of the lock 22, one of the locks with a severe outdraft, it took a lot of trust and coordination. And a lot of that trust was built around the galley table. That we would sit as a crew and eat and joke and laugh a little bit and maybe discuss what had gone on at the last lock and kind of get to know each other. And that built a lot of trust. I remember one time at lock 8, screwed up the approach. The head of the tow was out a little wide. We had 15 loads on a wide open river. And the lockman threw the handy line and it didn't go far enough. And as they were coiling it up, I've got this getting this thing slowed down and stop, and the head is running out like crazy. And I saw the mate was working on the intercom on the speaker at that time. This was on a barge line boat for Spartan Transportation. And I saw the two deckhands turn to run because you could hear the water going around the bullnose and going over the dam. So it was scary out there, and it was scary in the pilot house. And I saw the two deckhands turn to run. The mate was still there, trying to hook up the lock line. And I called out on the speaker and said, "Don't run, guys. Stay with me. I'll tell you when to run." And they all turned right back in, got the line, and went to work, and we got into the lock successfully. But working lines is hazardous. And it takes a lot of trust. It takes a lot of skill on the part of pilot on watch and the deck crew. Uh, for a lot of reasons anymore, mainly to do with pay, competitiveness. When I started in 75, I was the youngest guy on the crew, or in 78 when I went to work on line boats. I was 21 years old. I was the youngest guy on the crew. The rest of the crew were all men raising families. The pay was good enough at that time that guy could raise a family comfortably as a deckhand on a towboat. And nowadays, the money's not that good. Way too many. Well, take working on an offshore rig, for example, you work a 14-day schedule and get paid more money. So you're not away from home so much. You're not working those long hours.
Well, how much were deckhands making that they could support a family? Because I know today, starting at 35 or 50, uh, that
Mhm.
doesn't go very far.
No. So when I started as a green deckhand, I made $42 a day. But I bought my first pickup truck for $3,500. So that gives you an idea of what's going on. You're making 200 a day now, and a pickup truck is what, 50,000 bucks?
50 to 80, yeah, easily.
Yeah, right. So that
Well, now,
way out.
was $3,500 a brand new vehicle or a used one?
No, that was a brand new F-150.
Good for you.
Yeah. And,
I bought in 2004, I think. I bought a 1996 Dodge Dakota for 3,600.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, there for line haul for grain barge, grain boats, there were a lot of ways to make extra money because at that time when towboats were going northbound, the deckhands had the option of cleaning barges, and they got paid, I think, $20 a barge, which they split amongst themselves. So, when I worked with Ike Sullivan, who had made his career at Wisconsin Barge Lines for the most part, they were running 30 or 40 empties northbound, and all of those barges had to be cleaned. And so you drop a ladder in there, and you could do it on your off watch hours if you wanted to and make even more money. So not only were the wages higher in comparison to prices, but there were ways of making extra money as well. And so it was a completely different attitude. In the 80s, when the big slowdown came, Jimmy Carter had put an embargo on grain shipments to Russia. So a lot of the world found other places other than the U.S. to buy grain. And at the same time, the coal markets collapsed when South Africa undercut the U.S. Towboating went into just a terrible slump. And uh, instead of towboat people like Ray Eckstein or Peanut Hollinger or those guys owning towboat companies, banks and investment banks started owning companies. Companies like Ingram Barge Company, who was their primary business, Ingram Industries, was not barge transportation. That was a sideline until the 80s when Craig Phillips saw a really good opportunity to be buying assets at a very low price. So a difference in attitude towards boat crews came around at that time. And management companies had a tendency to see deckhands, deck crews as the same as like a guy throwing boxes on a semi trailer. And being a deckhand is much more skilled, like being a skilled iron worker or a skilled carpenter. It's a very uh, skilled occupation, and the compensation and the working conditions have not kept up over the years. And so people can go to work in other places, making more money, go home at night with their kids, and not be working in 103-degree temperatures in New Orleans or 17 below in Chicago. So it's still a really good job and a really good career. It's just hard to attract people who come to that business looking to make a career.
How do you see if you were running things for whomever? What ideas would you have to better attract people? Are we too limited because of the economic constraints now? Or and of course people from all ages, shapes, colors, sizes come to this industry, find it in their way. That's kind of the reason I started this
Mhm.
podcast. But when a few years back, I joined with Ingram in 2018, so it's been since then. There was something like a 55% turnover rate for new deckhands.
Right.
How do we address that?
Well,
Because aside from money, how is this any more attractive than a land job?
so first off, money. Money always talks and BS walks. So I had this conversation during a wage committee meeting that at that time the director of HR said, well, we're paying $10 an hour. That's $120 a day for a 12-hour day. And I said, no, actually, you're paying $8 and I don't know, 34 cents, but the other 4 hours you're paying 11 something. That's how it should work. And so when the guy who is riding the mower around in an industrial park is making $10 an hour straight time, for that next 4 hours, he's making time and a half. So he's making another 60 bucks and he gets to go home and drink a beer and hold his kids at the end of the day. So when I went to work on line boats, when I left home, my dad and I talked. He was an airline pilot, and we talked about passenger boats versus going away from home. And he said, well, if you're going to make money, you're going to have to go away from home. There is a cost for making more money. Well, there's a cost to a company for expecting their employees to be away from home. So some of what you're being compensated for is the actual work you do on the boat. Some of what you're being compensated for is the time you lose with your family and at home. And so the industry has cut the size of crews and expect the same amount of work to be done. I know when Orrin Ingram was the head of Ingram Barge Company, he expected the boats to be maintained just as they were when they had 3 men a watch, 2 men in the engine room, and a cook. And so now you've got 1 man on each watch on the lower on boats less than I think 7,200 and a guy on call watch, but you still want the boat to be maintained and you still want all of the paperwork, barge reports, and all of the forms and regulatory things. You want all of that done, and wages haven't kept up with that workload. So that's number one. Number two is taking people who have been gone from home for 28 days and putting them in a crew van and driving from New Orleans to Paducah. And then they get in their car in Paducah and have to drive to wherever home is. Man, it is a miserable son of a gun to ride in a 12-passenger van for 10 hours. So something has to be, a better way has to be made of that.
Well, not just
And
that. You mentioned, of course, the ride home after you get to your vehicle. One of my
right,
guests, Ty Matheny, was on here. He was with Artco. Um, I think I put a picture on his episode of it, but he was driving home from work one night and ended up in a ditch.
right.
Was in the hospital for quite a while. Anyway, sorry, please
Yep.
continue.
Yeah. And so then the other, and so all of this has been done to maximize profits. So if you look, we're talking about history, if you looked at steamboats, when Howard Timms started out in 1920, they had about 24 people on the boat. Of course, it was steam powered and they had a large engine room crew, but they had a cook and a cook's helper and a maid. The captain was more a business agent. Uh, and then they had two pilots. They had a mate and a watchman on each watch and three deckhands. So they had these really big crews and they were still able to make money. And those steamboats could only push about 6 barges. So now you have a 10,000, well, like Ty's boat, a 10,000, 11,000 horsepower boat that's pushing 49 barges southbound and 60 northbound with a crew of two, three, four, five, 6, 7, 8 people, 8 or 9 people. So don't tell me that that's necessary for the boat to make money. That's you can take that story somewhere else. Uh, and so that's another thing that's happened is and then like say you expect in maximizing profits in not sending the company plane in the instance of Ingram to New Orleans to make a crew change or not turning a boat at Memphis so that it's in the Paducah area. They do that is done to maximize profits at the cost of the employee. And so, you and I had talked offline back and forth a couple times about human resources. And human resources was coined in the 80s and into the 90s as managing people as a resource, just like the towboat and the rigging and the water and fuel that goes on the boat, not as people, but as a resource to be used and managed. And so when that changed, along with investment companies owning towboat companies, when all of that changed, the attitude uh, towards the employee changed. And you can call them associates or whatever you want, but they're still working for a living and they're dependent on a paycheck to raise their families.
So at the point of the industry sort of collapse due to that embargo and whatever other factors back then, so these financial powers moving in, that sort of commoditized crew, uh,
Mm-hmm.
is that the moment you sort of saw a measurable downturn in attitude in the workplace, in working conditions that have now led to the situation that we have today? Did it start from that point becoming less and less attractive? And how much damage do you think these financial powers have done?
So, yes, that was the beginning of the change of attitude in towboat companies towards their employees. Uh, in some ways, the hiring standards are better, so we get better quality employees. But uh, when you look at, so for instance, a guy doesn't need to be a high school graduate to crank ratchets or work a line. There's no need for that. And that man needs a job. And I've worked with people who were illiterate, who were eighth grade graduates, worked with people who in the red book, the rough log, if I hadn't known what had gone on the day before, I wouldn't have been able to decipher what they writing when we used to turn in our traffic on the sideband. But they were all very good employees and very good boatmen and very skillful at what they did. And so, in uh, tuning towards that solely, we are missing a great opportunity to not only have good employees, but to help people build a life for themselves and work out of poverty. Uh,
Do you think non-high school or yeah, non-high school graduates are as common today as they were in 1975?
yes,
Okay.
yep, there is there forgotten class of people in the United States brought on a lot of the anger and the changes that we're seeing in the U.S. now and in the political system. Those people feel like they've been left out, left behind, left out. And so, yeah, there you need in well, for instance, in Costa Rica, instead of one guy on a tractor mowing the highway and cutting brush, they got 10 guys out there with machetes. And so everybody has a job. Uh, everybody needs a job. That can't criminal past. I worked with a lot of people with a criminal past. Some of the people who were parolees or who were ex-cons were very good workers, kept to themselves and knew how to be in a confined situation. But too many human resources departments now push those people aside. If you don't have a driver's license, if you have past convictions, if you don't have a high school education, Ingram Barge Company doesn't want you anymore.
Well, I've heard even I think back in the 80s there would be jailhouse hires. Hey, I'm coming out or I'm it's a way out of jail. And I know today there are smaller companies that staff boats with work release guys.
They do. Lawson Brothers was a lease operator when Upper Mississippi River barge line was union and broke the union. They leased their equipment to different other captains. So that's how Lawson Brothers Towing, the Henry B, and those boats all got their start. And Lawson would go down to the county workhouse and bail out a bunch of guys, hire them out, and put them on a boat. Well, it was filling a need in both places. Those guys were out of circulation, not likely to go back to the causing the problems that they were making. It gave them an opportunity at a good job, and it staffed up a boat with affordable labor. So yeah, there was that as well. The flip side, one of the best things that happened since the 1980s is random drug testing because drugs and alcohol were a problem on towboats early in my career. It was like working on a pirate ship when I was a 23-year-old captain. And so that has really helped. Of course, the industry is now trying to reduce the number of drug testing and for a number of reasons, costs and the ability to hire qualified people. So kind of a back and forth with that.
Well, back in those 70s, early 80s, and I've heard stories never really on this program for obvious reasons. People still licensed out there working don't necessarily want to reveal certain details of their lives and histories. But uh, I have heard people smoking joints on deck in fleets building tow. How bad was it, and what adverse effects were seen or taking place? Because some people have said, "Oh, I work better when I'm." Under the influence
Hmm.
and all that stuff.
It was terrible. So I got to be a captain at 23 years old on a little 1800 horsepower boat. And then when I moved up to a 3600, the port captain had called me and said, I want you to fly to St. Paul and get on this boat and bring it on out. We're relieving the captain and the pilot. And so I went up there and found out that the captain and the pilot had cases of beer under a tarp on the Texas deck behind the pilot house. And when I got to lock 3 going southbound, the lock man says, uh, the Wabasha County Sheriff's Office wants you to give them a call when you make your approach to lock 4. And so called the chief up and I said, this is what they're doing. What the heck is going on? Well, there'd been a channel closure at Wabasha when the Chippewa River silted in the channel there, and they were dredging it. The captain and the crew had gone into Wabasha and had too much to drink. The crew said they had enough to drink, and they came back to the boat, leaving the captain and the cook. The captain and the cook stole a canoe and paddled it with their hands across the river, missed the boat in the current, landed on a sandbar, hollered for help. They went down and with the John boat, picked up the 2 of them, but the cook lost her teeth somewhere in this whole thing. So, that's the kind of behavior that not was pretty common, not in all companies, uh, not in all companies, but was pretty common and made it very difficult to be taken seriously as a profession and as an industry. And it was unsustainable. We couldn't go on like that.
Well, thank you for following me down those detours. But I do definitely want to get back. Take me back to the galley with Pappy Timms. Fill me in
Okay.
on his life and career.
Okay. So he had started out as a cabin boy for Federal Barge Lines when he was 14 years old. And maybe 1928, somewhere along in there, 72, 75. No, he was 72 and 75. He was born in 13. Yeah, so it would have been about 1927. And freight was regulated at that time. Uh, the cabotage laws of 1924 had passed and kind of regulated crews and how seamen were to be treated. That's one of the things. Uh, it's also called the Jones Act because of its protections for seamen. So Pappy had gone to work for Federal Barge Lines in 27 or 28 as a cabin boy. He and the maid made beds and did the cleanup. Cook and the cook's helper did the cooking. And he told me at one point they were northbound on the lower, and of course prohibition was still on, and they pushed into the bank in the fog and took up a collection and sent him up because on Stack Island there was a moonshiner. And he went up there with the 50 cents and put it on a stump and walked away and came back, and there were some bottles of moonshine. He brought it back to the boat, and everybody got drunk and caused a big fuss, and it was a mess. So we were still kind of outlaw pirate ship days. But then at that time, there was still some rigging that was steamboat ratchets, which are different than the ratchets we use today. They were about 30 pounds heavier, and they had because in the old days they put barges together with chain links instead of cables, instead of wires with eyes and links and slings, straps. You had to have a lot of travel, and so uh, when steamboat ratchets were run out, they probably had a 6 foot reach, big barrel, chain link on either end, and yeah, they weighed about somewhere around between 80 and 90 pounds. And so we carried all the rigging. Pappy told me when I first got on the boat with him, I was a young guy, 6'2" and 185 pounds. So get out there the first watch, I'm on watch with him. He puts a ratchet on one shoulder, wire on my other shoulder, shows me how to carry a strap and puts my flashlight in my mouth and says to me, now, when you get to be a pilot, I'll know that you're one pilot that carried a full set of rigging. Follow me. And out across there we went. And he would tell me stories about steamboating and in the old days and putting barges together. And he had a pool hall in Metropolis. The police were always in the pool hall trying to get information on different of the hard cases in Metropolis. And so it was hard work, but his stories kept it all entertaining. He carried a bottle, a dishwashing liquid bottle of oil. And every time I'd run a ratchet out, he'd squirt oil on the threads of the ratchet. And that was kind of his job. He just followed me around out there and told me which of the wires to tighten. And so uh, he he had really gotten old, and we turned a boat, and he was coming over, and he brought his suitcase, was wearing his coveralls, long underwear, wore red union suits, had his work clothes underneath, wearing his coveralls, carried his suitcase over, and when we left and took off, he realized that he hadn't packed his suitcase. Little old man had, so he would wear his long underwear under his coveralls, wash the long underwear, wear his clothes under his coveralls, and back and forth like that. And so that was kind of a funny little story towards the end of his career. He was getting old enough at that point, it was time to quit. He would tell me, son, I used to be a hoss just like you. Let me tell you something. They'll just break you down and throw you aside. Don't let them do it to you.
Well, and we'll get into that for your retirement, which we'll cover a little bit. But you mentioned a little while ago the New Orleans Harbor back in the day. When is the first time you passed through there at the Sticks?
1980,
And when was the last?
2020.
Okay, so
So,
40 years apart. Tell me how the New Orleans Harbor was back in 80, and then we'll fast forward and discuss into your retirement.
okay. So, the first time I ran down through the New Orleans Harbor, I had the chart in my lap, a flashlight in my mouth, and was trying to keep up with what was going on with both hands, man. Um, I didn't know all the landmarks and things that well. I hadn't been around ships that much, and traffic going everywhere just like it is now with very little control. New Orleans traffic, you had some check-in places, but it was just,
Were all the existing bridges still, were they there yet?
yes, yep,
Okay,
they were all there.
okay.
Uh, the last time I went through, of course, now we have Rose Point and AIS. So that has really made a big difference in being able to keep up with the amount of traffic in a one-person pilot house. I think it was really good that I learned the mental habit of monitoring radio traffic and listening for different points rather than zoning out or looking at my phone and depending on Rose Point to tell me where people are. Turn the radio down and not listen to all the chatter. Uh, at the end of my career at 63 years old, I was starting to have problems keeping up with all of that traffic, just old mind and don't hear as well. And so Rose Point was of a great benefit. But I would tell young guys uh, to monitor the radio all the time and get used to cross referencing the Rose Point screen and radio traffic and what New Orleans traffic is telling you. You can't depend on just one of those systems. And of course, Rule 5 says it that you're in violation of the law if you're not using all available means to maintain your lookout.
And well, what was your last run prior to retirement? The last time you stepped off a boat, where were you? What kind of tow was it? Where'd you end up?
So I contracted with Magnolia Marine and got on a boat at Bayou Pigeon. Went out through Bayou Sorrel and out through the Port Allen route, went south to uh, oh would have been dock below Exxon Miro, It was down there is where we were, below Industrial Canal, below, just above Lower Nine, and then came all the way back up through Vicksburg, and I got off the boat at Caruthersville. My wife had a veterinary technician, had worked at Texas A&M in the veterinary school and had worked in the scrub in, scrub out labs. So this was February of 2020, and we were keeping up with what was going on with COVID. She was tracking that because she's very good at epidemiology. The Centers for Disease Control had consulted with her on a form of COVID that was going through research animals years before. And so we had agreed that this was going to be a good time for me to make some cash and bring it home before things really got bad. So I was riding the Dennis Ross and listening to the BBC World Service on the midnight watch. They were talking about uh, how the spread of COVID was affecting China and Europe. And then at 3 in the morning, I would go to Bloomberg Financial for their Asian markets. And in the Asian markets, then they're talking about how many containers are sitting on the docks and how many ships are at anchor and not being loaded or unloaded. So I knew that that wasn't going to be a good deal, that this was going to be ugly. And I got off in Caruthersville, drove straight home to New Mexico. And I think the following Monday, when the stock market crashed, I applied for Social Security and called it enough. And that was the end of that. I had some expert witness cases still pending, and they were all delayed. And the last of those are just kind of being cleaned up now. One of those cases was the cooperative spirit RC Creppel collision. And that one was delayed for a couple of years because of COVID. That trial was.
Well, ultimately, this conversation was leading up to that very topic. We've not discussed it really in any detail prior to right now, so I'm not entirely sure which direction we're going to go with this, or which direction what conclusions you've made from your experiences. But please fill me in as you're able, and I'd like to publish this. I'd like to keep it in, so I'm certainly concerned for reasons that you'll certainly grasp.
Yeah. So uh, I was the morning of the collision. I think it was February 20th of 2020. Now I was home, so it would have been early March, somewhere along, or no, nope, it would have been earlier than that. Would have been January of 2020. I was home reading, going through Facebook, and on the towboat pages there was an announcement that the Creppel had been sunk at 40 miles, just above the Luling Bridge. Uh, and there was a screenshot from a Rose Point had been posted. That was at about 5:30 in the morning. At 9 a.m., I got a call from Kelly Savan, an attorney at Duncan Savan in New Orleans, who represented Mr. Creppel in his business interests. And she told me what had gone on. And I said I was aware of it, but I was not going to commit to working for anybody until more facts had come out. I was not going to accuse a fellow mariner of any kind of misconduct uh, just for money. Not going to take that. So I contacted another pilot who was on a boat at the time, who works as expert, and in fact was an expert in this particular case as well. And he sent me another screenshot. We discussed the location of the RC Creppel and where it had sunk, and I called Ms. Savan back and said I would take the case. So that we put together a team of people. Steve Cunningham, who is an accident recreationist, was a British Maritime Academy grad and a ship pilot in Britain, and is now living in the U.S. And he does animations, reconstructive animations using data points that come from all of the GPS information that's available. And was me, him, a PhD from the University of Utah, who is the foremost expert in distractions, has helped to write the federal codes for the FAA and the railroads, has worked with European countries in the same capacity, has done a lot of test pad research on distracted driving and cell phone use. Then a marine architect was hired as well. We gathered all of the Rose Point data, the raw, they're called a CE VDR file, Coastal Explorer Voyage Data Recording file, which is the raw data bits that are that the program uses to create a display. And so I have a licensed copy of Rose Point, and I could load that in there, set it up like my screen that I would be looking at on a boat, and then watch the playback and determine what had gone on. In addition, there were the uh, Coast Guard New Orleans traffic broadcasts, and the Cooperative Spirit carried a device commonly called a blue box, which records radio conversations on each handset, plus the radar images and different video images around the boat. So I had all of that, and that team worked for about 3 years going to trial and putting all of this together and determining what was our opinion as to what happened. And so there was a ship northbound behind the Cooperative Spirit going at about twice the speed, and the RC Creppel coming downbound, making about 11 miles an hour over ground with a following current. And the way it was setting up, using the predicted passing points on the Rose Point, it was obvious that all three of these vessels were going to meet right on the point at the same time in roaring high water in the dark, 5 o'clock in the morning, which was just a really bad choice. And no one in that interaction broke that chain of errors. So when I worked at the Seamen's Church, we talked about competent error, which is most accidents happen to people with quite a bit of experience. They're just not catching the beginning of a chain of errors in time to stop the circumstances which create an accident. And so the Cooperative Spirit was northbound, and the ship behind him called, and they agreed to let the ship overtake on the one whistle. The ship was going to come around the point, and the Spirit was going to fall off into the bend to allow him room as they came up around the point. Then there were personal telephone calls in the pilot house of the Cooperative Spirit. In addition, the video camera from overhead in the Cooperative Spirit pilot house showed a reflection of the operator manipulating a cell phone. And so during that time, the RC Creppel announces that he's coming downstream and he and the cooperative spirit exchange a one whistle passing agreement. So you're going to have the Creppel coming down on the one, the spirit coming around the point, holding close enough to the point to allow the Creppel to get by, and then the spirit had a 40 barge tow, about 7.5 acres of barges. The spirit was going to have to move across the river after meeting the Creppel quickly enough to allow the ship to come through between the point and the spirit. And somewhere in all of that, it's my opinion that the pilot of the spirit lost situational awareness, that he had taken each of these meeting passing maneuvers individually without recognizing what all of them were going to wind up doing. So during this time, the spirit was moving quite slowly, and the Rose Point file showed the way I set it up. And as people who are hearing this that are familiar with Rose Point know, you can set this up so that it has lateral motion indicators that show on the Rose Point screen in instrument panels, something that I use a lot. And that will show you whether you're drafting to the right or the left or you're running straight. You can also use the uh, course over ground vector and a thing called a rate of turn predictor, which shows a predicted ghost icon out ahead of the toe for whatever length of time you choose. And so in doing all of that, using those features, I could see that the cooperative spirit at making 3.5 miles an hour over ground and about 10 miles an hour, 9.5 to 10 through the water, was being pushed laterally back and forth in the channel. And in looking at the radar recording, I could see the wheel wash echoes coming out from behind the spirit and see how much rudder was being used. And so the pilot on the spirit was reacting to being drafted. He wasn't anticipating the drafts. As a result, he was drafted under the point at Magnolia Fleet and came close enough to Magnolia Fleet in trying to steer out away from it on the video that he was within 100 feet of the loaded fleets and at a pretty profound angle trying to shove back away from them so that when the head of the tow, 7 long, 1,400 feet away from the pilot house, came out from under the point, and the current caught those barges broadside on the head. Now it was trapping the head as the operator of the spirit tried to turn up into the current and run parallel, shape the bend and run parallel with the shore. As a result, then, the Creppel coming downstream, when the spirit sheared out from under the point, the spirit could not get up into the current and he ran over the Creppel, resulting in the capsizing and the death of 3 men. So at trial, the expert on distraction, and I found this very interesting, said that even with a hands-free set, talking on the cell phone is the equivalent of being 0.08 blood alcohol level, which he had quantified on a test pad at the University of Utah running through cones and progressively giving alcohol and then having people do it while talking. Now, a non-hands-free set or texting is even worse. And the other thing that he brought up during the trial was that it takes between 30 seconds and a minute for your mind to shift from the subject which you were talking about on a cell phone back into a situational awareness in of what is actually going on around you. So that's why people will talk on a hands-free cell phone in traffic and hang up the call and be 4 miles down the road and not remember any green lights or any of the traffic along the way. You're you're just kind of operating on autopilot, which is not good for situational awareness. So that was a huge factor in that accident, which all of us have done at one time or another. So for the people who are watching this that are going to be pissed about what I'm saying, this is a fact, and this is something you have to be aware of as a professional, as operating a boat. If the office calls and you're not in a good place, if home calls and you're not in a good place, you're going to have to tell them to call back later. I left a message on my voicemail when we got to Devil's Swamp that we were in the New Orleans Baton Rouge corridor and I would be returning calls when I was off watch. And that was the end of that. And so we all have to be very disciplined about cell phone use because the consequences can be deadly. So that went to trial and was a full week. A lot came up, all of the testimony, and then the judge in that case ordered the two parties to go back to mediation and settle. What had happened in that case and happens in maritime admiralty maritime law, which is one of was discussed briefly in the Baltimore Harbor Bridge ship accident, is that under a law that goes back to British Admiralty law, if I give Tim a well-found vessel and a competent crew to go do business in my name, and they go screw up and crash, I cannot be held liable for anything more than the value of the ship and its cargo. But if I have privity or knowledge of a condition which affects the seaworthiness of the vessel, whether it's crew, the vessel, or any of its equipment, then liability is unlimited. So the defendants, ADM Artco, had filed a motion for what's called exoneration or limitation of liability. The value of the Spirit and its barges and cargo were somewhere around $11 million, 10 and a half or $11 million. And the plaintiffs in the case were asking for a lot more than that. So ADM Artco was fighting everything, all which is very common. You just fight, don't cooperate and fight everything. But it turned out that Artco had a policy against cell phone use on watch, cell phone use in the pilot house, and that supervisory personnel knew that their guys were using a cell phone in the pilot house. So they had privity or knowledge of a condition which could affect the seaworthiness of the vessel. In addition, the captain of the port, New Orleans, had issued a warning on a previous occasion, which I think was the ACBL tug that was run over by a ship at Marrero with a big pollution incident, about cell phone use. So this was a well-known problem. So so it looked like that we, the RC Creppel interests, would be able to break the limitation of liability. And that brought ADM back to the bargaining table, and they settled with the parties, the plaintiffs, the three men who had lost their lives, and Creppel and Union Carbide. No decision came from that. There was no apportionment of blame, which is common in maritime cases. It's rare that one party is 100% at fault. They'll say, well, you should have made this radio call, so you're 15% to blame, and the guy that ran over you is 85% to blame. But what then came up was action against the license of the pilot on watch. And that went to a suspension and revocation hearing, an S&R hearing in January of 24 in New Orleans before an administrative law judge, which is a completely different type of hearing and courtroom behavior. In that case, I was subpoenaed by the U.S. Coast Guard to come and testify. And as a part of that subpoena, I still had all of my records, all of the depositions, and all of the evidence in that. And I turned all of that over to the Coast Guard and sat before an ALJ judge and was uh, questioned and answered by the defendant's attorney, by the Coast Guard's attorney, and by the judge. And that there's been no decision as to whether the pilot will have his license suspended or revoked at this time. And that is about all I'm comfortable with saying about all of that until there is a decision and all of those things become public record. Now, everything in the civil trial is public record. So the things that I've spoken to here are my opinion, which was submitted and in at trial and in my report, and all of the other things that are public record as well.
And I do appreciate you sharing what you have, and I don't necessarily want to finish on that. It's rather a heavy topic. Um, but I'm also kind of fresh out of questions. I was reviewing our prior conversations um, privately. Were there any topics that we have not covered or any stories that you had in the chamber that we have not discussed?
No, really, we had talked about a number of topics, but we've really filled up this particular episode, as you know. And so I do have other topics. We talked about the change in the nature of the business, and perhaps in the future we can talk about the change in the nature of captains and pilots towards deckhands and the conduct that's expected on the boat now as uh, as opposed to how captains were able to treat deckhands in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. Safety and just the way you talk to people and the way people are treated. There's been a profound change in that as well.
Well, let's plan on doing that for sure. Let me know when you find some more time in that busy retirement life in Costa Rica, sir.
Sure thing, sure thing. I'm at your convenience. Every day is a day off.
Good for you, sir. Thanks very much.
All right, you take care. Thank you.
All right, you too.